The blood on the badge was still wet when Thunder dropped it at Joseph. White Horse's weathered boots, the old Cherokee elder stood frozen on his cabin, porch morning coffee growing cold in his gnarled hands as he stared down at the silver star that caught the first rays of Tennessee sunrise. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He'd seen that badge every Sunday dinner for the past 5 years, pinned proudly to his grandson's uniform shirt, while I'll be horns waggled. Joseph whispered, his voice cracking like autumn leaves. That dog's telling me something I don't want to hear. Thunder sat back on his haunches, amber eyes never leaving the old man's face. The German shepherd's once magnificent coat hung loose on his frame, ribs visible beneath matted fur that spoke of 18 months. Living rough in the Tennessee hills, scars crisscrossed his left shoulder where buckshot had found him during his wandering years, and his right ear bore the notch from his police days, a reminder of the explosion that took his partner, Officer Sarah. Rainwater and shattered his world, but it was Thunder's eyes that broke Joseph's heart. Those intelligent amber depths held something. The old man recognized the look of a soldier carrying bad news, the weight of knowledge too heavy for one soul to bear alone. Joseph's arthritic fingers trembled as he bent to retrieve the badge, his 5-year-old joints protesting every movement. The metal felt warm against his palm, sticky with blood that wasn't quite dry. Detective Jacob White, his grandson, his pride, his last living family connection to a world that seemed determined to forget the old ways. The phone rang inside the cabin, its shrill cry cutting through the morning silence. Like a knife through prayer, Joseph's blood turned to ice water. Nobody called this early unless something terrible had happened. Thunder wed low in his throat, a sound that raised every hair on the old man's neck. Joseph shuffled inside Thunder, padding silently behind him. The cabin smelled of sage and old wood, Cherokee artifacts lining the walls like silent witnesses to generations of White Horse strength. But strength felt like a luxury Joseph couldn't afford as he reached for the phone. With hands that shook like leaves in a storm, "Joseph Whitehorse." He answered, his voice steady despite the chaos raging in his chest. The voice that came through the receiver was distorted, electronically altered, but the venom in it was crystal clear. "Old man, you've got 18 hours. Joseph's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this sign? The paper's grandfather. Transfer the Sacred Grove to Stonecrow Development, or Jacob dies. 18 hours, old man. The clock starts now." The line went dead. Joseph stood holding the phone like it might come alive and bite him, the words echoing in his skull like thunder rolling through the mountains. 18 hours. The Sacred Grove, the last untouched piece of Cherokee land in these parts, where his ancestors were buried, where the spirits still walked among the ancient oaks. Thunder pressed against Joseph's legs, a warm, solid presence that anchored him to the moment. The dog's nose nudged the bloody badge still clutched in Joseph's free hand, and those amber eyes held a message clearer than words: "We have work to do." Joseph looked down at the magnificent animal who'd appeared at his door 6 months ago, half dead from starvation and carrying wounds that went deeper than flesh he'd fed. Thunder nursed him back to health, but he'd never been able to heal the broken spirit inside. Thunder had loved his handler with the fierce loyalty only dogs understood, and Sarah's death had shattered him as surely as it had ended her life. But now, looking into those intelligent eyes, Joseph saw something he hadn't seen in months: purpose. "You know where he is, don't you, boy?" Joseph whispered. "You found Jacob." Thunder barked, once sharp and decisive, the bark of a police dog signaling his handler. It was the first sound he'd made since arriving at Joseph's cabin, and it cut through the morning air like a gunshot. The old Cherokee elder felt something shift in his chest, a gathering of strength he thought he'd lost years ago. His grandson was out there somewhere, bleeding, scared, maybe dying. The Sacred Grove, sacred land that had been in his family for 200 years, was being held hostage. Joseph Whitehorse had survived the jungles of Vietnam, buried 2 sons, and watched the world try to erase everything his people held sacred. He was 85 years old, his body was failing, and his heart was held together with spit and stubbornness, but he wasn't finished yet. 18 hours, he said to Thunder, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Well, boy, I reckon we better get started." Thunder stood his tail, giving the faintest twitch. Not quite a wag, but close enough to hope for the first time in 18 months. The broken police dog had found something worth fighting for, and for the first time in years, Joseph Whitehorse remembered what it felt like to be dangerous. Leave alike. and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The gravel road to town kicked up dust clouds behind Joseph's battered pickup truck as Thunder shotgunned his massive head hanging. Out the passenger window, the German shepherd's nostrils flared, testing every scent carried on the morning breeze, but his amber eyes remained fixed on the horizon with military focus. Joseph's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to turn his knuckles white, the bloody badge now wrapped in a clean handkerchief and tucked into his shirt pocket right over his heart. 17.5 hours, the numbers burned in his mind like a brand desert. Paws Veterinary Clinic sat at the edge of Millbrook's main strip, a modest building with peeling paint and a hand-carved wooden sign that had weathered too many Tennessee storms. Joseph had been bringing Thunder here for months, ostensibly for checkups, but really because the young woman who ran the place had kind eyes and gentle hands, the sort of person who understood that some wounds couldn't be seen on x-rays. Dr. Mary Clearwater emerged from the clinic side door as Joseph pulled into the gravel lot, her auburn hair caught in a messy bun that couldn't quite contain the morning humidity's effects. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years mending creatures others had given up on. Cherokee and Irish blood mixed in her veins, though she didn't know the significance of the former, couldn't remember much of anything from before her accident 15 years ago. Joseph, she called, genuine warmth in her voice as Thunder bounded toward her. I wasn't expecting you today. Is everything? Her words died as Thunder reached her, pressing his massive body against her legs with an urgency that made her stumble backward. The dog whined low in his throat, a sound that seemed to come from his soul, and fixed those intelligent amber eyes on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Thunder, what's gotten into you? She whispered, running her hands through his matted fur, but even as she spoke, something flickered behind her green eyes, a shadow of recognition she couldn't quite grasp. Joseph watched the interaction with his heart hammering against his ribs. Mary's touch seemed to calm Thunder in a way nothing else had for months, and the dog's reaction to her was unlike anything Joseph had seen. Thunder sniffed at Mary's hands, her hair, her clothes, his tail giving the faintest tremor of movement. Doc, Joseph said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of 85 years and secrets that felt heavier than mountains. I need your help. Thunder found something this morning, and I think... He paused, studying Mary's face as Thunder continued his anxious investigation of her presence. I think someone's in trouble. Mary's hands stilled in Thunder's fur. Something about the old man's tone, the way he said her name, sent an inexplicable shiver down her spine. She'd been treating Thunder for 6 months, had grown fond of both the broken police dog and his taciturn guardian, but there was something different about Joseph today. Something desperate and dangerous that made her pulse quicken. What kind of trouble, she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Joseph pulled the wrapped badge from his pocket, unwrapping it with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. The morning sun caught the silver star, but it was the dark stains on the metal that made Mary's stomach clench with dread. Thunder brought me this, Joseph said simply. It belongs to my grandson, Detective Jacob White. Horse. Mary's hands flew to her mouth. She'd seen the missing person reports plastered around town for the past 3 days, had wondered about the young police officer who'd vanished without a trace, but seeing the blood-stained badge in Joseph's weathered hands made it real in a way that shocked her system. Oh my God. She breathed. Joseph, you have to call the police. Can't do that. Doc. Joseph's voice was granite final as a gravestone. The man who took Jacob, he's got connections, called me this morning, gave me 18 hours to sign over some land that's been in my family for 2 centuries. I go to the law. Jacob dies. Thunder wet again. Pressing closer to Mary, as if seeking comfort from an old friend, the dog's behavior was becoming more agitated by the minute, his intelligent eyes darting between Mary and Joseph like he was trying to communicate something neither human could understand. Mary knelt beside Thunder, her hands finding the sweet spot behind his ears that always calmed him. But today her touch seemed to have the opposite effect. The dog trembled under her fingers, and when she looked into his amber eyes, she saw something that made her heart race. Recognition, as if Thunder knew her from somewhere, somewhen in the fog of memories she couldn't quite reach. Some secrets are like old wounds, Joseph said quietly, watching Mary work with Thunder. They never He'll write. If you keep picking at them, the words hit Mary like a physical blow. She'd heard those exact words before, spoken in the same growly voice, but she couldn't remember when or where. Her head began to pound with the familiar ache that came whenever she tried to push past the wall in her memory, the wall that had existed since her accident. 15 years ago, Joseph, she said slowly, her voice uncertain. Have we met before? Thunder, the old Cherokee elder's face went carefully blank, but Thunder's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The dog barked once sharp and urgent, then padded to the clinic's door and back to Mary, his message clear: we need to go. Now Joseph checked his watch, the numbers blurring slightly in his tired eyes. 17 hours and 15 minutes time was bleeding away like water through his fingers, and Jacob was out there somewhere, hurt and scared and maybe dying. Doc, he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't afford to show. I know this is asking a lot, but Thunder is trying to tell us something he's got training most folks can't even imagine, and if he brought me that badge, he knows where. Jacob, as Mary stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, everything about this morning felt surreal, like walking through someone else's nightmare, but Thunder's urgency was infectious, and something deep in her chest, some instinct she couldn't name, told her that Joseph White was a man she could trust with her life. What do you need me to do? She asked. Follow us, Joseph said simply. Thunder's got a trail to follow, and I've got a feeling we're going to need all the help we can get. The old wall clock inside the clinic ticked away another minute, its steady rhythm like a heartbeat, counting down to disaster. 17 hours and 14 minutes in the distance. Thunder had already started moving toward the treine behind the clinic, his nose to the ground and his powerful body coiled with purpose for the first time in 18 months. The broken police dog had found his mission, and Mary Clearwater, though she didn't understand why, knew she was about to remember things she'd forgotten. The memories came to Joseph like smoke drifting through autumn trees, soft at first, then burning with the clarity of yesterday, 20 years ago, when his hair was still more black than silver and his back didn't ache with every step he'd stood on this same porch watching his son Tommy work in the garden behind the cabin. The boy had been 25 then, strong shouldered and quick to laugh, his Cherokee features sharp and proud beneath the Tennessee sun. Tell me again about the sacred grove, P. Tommy had said, wiping sweat from his brow as he straightened from planting corn. His voice held the same reverence Joseph's own father had used when speaking of holy things, and it made the old man's heart swell with pride. It's where your great-great-grandmother walks, Joseph had replied, settling into his favorite rocking chair with a cup of coffee that tasted like home, where the spirits of our people gather when the veil grows thin. 7 generations of white horse blood is buried in that soil, son. It's not just land, it's the beating heart of who we are. Tommy had nodded solemnly, but even then Joseph had noticed something flickering behind his son's dark eyes, a restlessness that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat and everything to do with the modern world calling to young Cherokee men with promises of easy money and easier lives. How much you reckon it's worth? P in dollars. The question had hit Joseph like cold water, and he'd set his coffee cup down with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. Tommy, some things can't be measured in white man's money. That grove has value beyond, but if someone offered. Tommy had pressed his voice, taking on an edge that made Joseph's stomach clench with dread. If someone made a real offer, enough to set up the whole family for life, wouldn't it be worth considering? Joseph had studied his son's face in the golden afternoon light, searching for the boy who used to sit wide-eyed through stories of Cherokee warriors and sacred ceremonies, but something had changed in Tommy's expression, a hardness that spoke of conversations. Joseph hadn't been part of decisions made in shadows and silence, son. Joseph had said carefully, there are some things a man can't sell without selling his soul along with them. The memory shifted, growing darker like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. 3 months later, Joseph had found Tommy in the barn after midnight, huddled over papers spread across the workbench like battle plans. The yellow glow of the kerosene lamp revealed contracts and surveys, legal documents that made Joseph's blood run cold. What is this? Joseph had demanded, snatching up a paper that bore the head of Stonecrow Development. Tommy, what have you done? His son had looked up with eyes that held no shame, only a desperate kind of defiance that cut Joseph deeper than any blade. It's our way out, P. Our way to something better than scraping by on welfare checks and tourist dollars. These are surveys of the sacred grove, Joseph had whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his heart breaking. "You brought outsiders onto holy ground, it's just land P." Tommy had exploded, surging to his feet with fists clenched at his sides. "Dirt and trees and old stories that don't put food on the table or send kids to college. You want to live in the past forever, but I've got a future to think about." The words that hung between them like poison in the air, and Joseph had felt something die inside his chest. Some fundamental trust between father and son that, once broken, could never be fully repaired. "Get out," Joseph had said quietly. "P, listen to me, get out." The roar had come from somewhere deep in Joseph's soul, carrying with it the fury of 7 generations of ancestors whose blood was mixed with Sacred Grove soil. "Take your papers and your promises and your 30 pieces of silver and get off my land." Tommy had gathered the contracts with hands that shook, but his voice remained steady as granite. "You'll change your mind, Pa, when you're sitting alone in this cabin with nothing but pride to keep you warm. You'll remember this conversation and wish you'd listened if I lived to be 100. Joseph had replied, his voice cold as winter wind. "I will never sign those papers, and if you set one foot on the Sacred Grove again, you are no son of mine." The last thing Joseph remembered from that night was the sound of Tommy's truck pulling away from the cabin, its tail lights disappearing into darkness like dying stars. For 20 years, Joseph had held to his word. For 20 years. He'd lived with the choice he'd made, choosing Cherokee tradition over Cherokee blood, the sacred over the familiar, but now standing in his kitchen with thunder pressed against his legs and Jacob's bloody badge burning like a coal in his pocket, Joseph wondered if pride was too expensive a luxury when family blood was being spilled. Did I push him away, or did greed pull him from me? The questions circled in his mind like buzzards over Carrarian, picking at wounds that had never properly healed. He'd been so sure 20 years ago, so righteous in his anger and disappointment, but watching Tommy's face crumble as he gathered those contracts, Joseph had seen something he'd tried to forget. Fear, not greed, but desperation, but the terror of a young man watching his culture disappear, one treaty violation and casino compromise at a time. Maybe Tommy hadn't been trying to destroy Cherokee heritage, maybe he'd been trying to save what little they had left, using the only currency the white world understood: thunder. Wed, softly pressing his cold nose against Joseph's weathered hand, the dog's amber eyes held a wisdom that transcended species, and Joseph found himself wondering what thunder would choose: pack loyalty or principle? Would a dog abandon his littermate to preserve some abstract ideal, or would love always trump philosophy when blood was on the line? "I was so sure I was right," Joseph whispered to the empty kitchen, so damn sure that keeping the land pure was worth losing the boy. But purity was a luxury when your grandson was bleeding out somewhere in the Tennessee hills, when 18 hours stretched ahead like a gauntlet of impossible choices. Joseph had spent 20 years proving he could live without his son, but he wasn't sure he could live with himself. If Jacob died because of pride disguised as principle, the old Cherokee elder sank into his kitchen chair, feeling every one of his 85 years settling into his bones like winter frost outside. Morning was burning toward afternoon, and time was a river flowing away from him faster than he could cup it in his hands. Thunder moved to the window, his powerful body tense with purpose as he stared toward the treine where Mary Clearwater waited. The dog's training was reasserting itself, police instincts overriding months of grief and confusion. Someone needed rescuing, and Thunder remembered what it meant to serve. Joseph pulled himself to his feet, bones creaking like old floorboards, and looked around the cabin that had been home to 7 generations of white horsemen. If he signed those papers to save Jacob, all of this would be lost. The Sacred Grove would fall to bulldozers and concrete, the spirits of his ancestors displaced by parking lots and profit margins. But if he didn't sign, Jacob would die, and the white horse line would end anyway, not with the dignity of resistance, but with the bitter irony of sacrifice made meaningless by stubbornness. Sometimes Joseph realized with crystal clarity there were no good choices, only necessary ones. Thunder moved through the Tennessee hills like a ghost made flesh, his powerful legs carrying him along paths that existed more in memory than reality. Joseph and Mary struggled to keep pace behind him, their breathing harsh in the afternoon heat as they followed the German shepherd deeper into terrain that grew wilder with each passing mile. The dog's nose worked, constantly testing every shift in the wind, every scent carried on the autumn breeze that whispered secrets through dying leaves. 16 hours the numbers hammered in Joseph's skull with each labored heartbeat. As he pushed his 5-year-old body beyond its limits, Mary stayed close beside him, her hand occasionally steadying his elbow when the uneven ground threatened to send him tumbling. But it was Thunder who led them unerringly forward, his amber eyes locked on some distant destination that called to instincts deeper than training. Their Thunder stopped abruptly at the crest of a ridge, his body going rigid with the focused intensity Joseph remembered from police dogs on the scent below them. Nestled in a hollow between two hills stood the remnants of an old root cellar, a concrete bunker half buried in earth and overgrown with 20 years of neglect. Rusted metal doors hung askew on broken hinges, and the whole structure looked like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Joseph's blood turned to ice water as he recognized the location. His grandfather had built that cellar during the Depression, storing vegetables and canned goods against the lean winter months Joseph himself had played in those tunnels as a boy before they'd been sealed up and forgotten. But now, seeing fresh tire tracks in the mud around the entrance, he understood why Thunder had led them here. It was the perfect prison, isolated, forgotten, and buried deep enough that screams wouldn't carry Jesus Christ. Mary whispered, her face pale as cemetery marble. Is that where? Jacob, Joseph called out, his voice cracking like a whip across the hollow. Jacob, can you hear me? The response came immediately, a weak voice from somewhere deep in the earth. Horsero. With pain and dehydration. Grandpa, is that you? Joseph started down the slope, but Thunder's growl stopped him cold. The dog's hackles were raised, his powerful body coiled for violence as he stared at the tree-line beyond the cellar. 3 men emerged from the shadows, assault rifles held with the casual competence of professionals. They wore hunting clothes and baseball caps, but their eyes held the flat emptiness of soldiers who'd crossed too many lines to find their way back. And behind them, moving with the deliberate stride of a man who owned everything he surveyed, came Tommy Blackwood. 20 years had not been kind to Joseph's son. Tommy's once proud Cherokee features were soft, now puffy with drink and disappointment. His black hair was stir with premature gray, and his dark eyes held a bitterness that made Joseph's heart ache with recognition. This was what happened when a man spent 2 decades justifying choices that poisoned his soul with each passing day. Hello, P. Tommy said, his voice carrying the mock-casual tone of a man trying to prove he felt nothing. Figured you'd come eventually. That dog of yours has quite a nose for trouble. Joseph stepped forward, Mary close beside him, while Thunder positioned himself between the family members like a referee preparing for violence. The old Cherokee elder studied his son's face, searching for some trace of the boy who'd once helped him plant corn and listen to stories of Cherokee warriors. Tommy, Joseph said quietly, let Jacob go. Whatever's between us, he's done nothing wrong. Tommy's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Done nothing wrong, P. Your precious grandson has been investigating our family for 6 months. FBI task force looking into casino development on tribal lands. Did you know that? Did you know? Jacob's been digging through every contract, every deal, every handshake that's kept food on Cherokee tables for the past 20 years. The words hit Joseph like physical blows he'd known. Jacob was ambitious, had watched his grandson rise through the police ranks with fierce pride, but FBI investigation. Joseph glanced toward the root cellar, trying to reconcile the image of his honest, straightforward grandson with the complex web Tommy was describing. You're lying, Mary said suddenly, her voice sharp with conviction that surprised everyone, including herself. Jacob wouldn't. What? Tommy turned his attention to Mary, and something flickered across his features, recognition mixed with something darker. Doc, Mary Clearwater, right? Funny thing about amnesia. Sometimes people remember the damnedest things at the worst possible times. Thunder's growl deepened, and the dog moved closer to Mary with protective instincts that seemed to transcend mere affection. Joseph watched the interaction with growing unease, sensing undercurrents he couldn't quite grasp. What are you talking about, Tommy? Ask her, asked Doc Clearwater, about her accident 15 years ago. Ask her about the car that went off Devil's Curve on a perfectly clear night. Ask Her why she doesn't remember anything from before that crash. Mary's face had gone white as chalk, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her temples. I don't understand. What does my accident have to do with? Because it wasn't an accident, Tommy said quietly, because you're not Mary Clearwater, you're Mary Whitehorse, you're my sister P, the daughter you thought you'd buried. 15 years ago, the world seemed to tilt sideways. Joseph felt his knees buckle, would have fallen if thunder hadn't pressed against him with solid, warm strength. Mary, his little girl who'd loved horses and Cherokee stories and helping her grandmother bead jewelry, was standing 3 feet away with green eyes that suddenly looked heartbreakingly familiar. No, Joseph whispered. Mary died. We buried her. I spoke at the funeral. You buried a Jane Doe from the county morgue, Tommy said, his voice gaining momentum like a stone rolling downhill. I needed Mary gone. P, she'd found out about my deals with Stonecrow. Development was threatening to expose everything, so I arranged a little accident, made sure she'd forget who she was, even if she survived. Mary staggered backward, her hands clutching at her head as fragmented memories began forcing their way through the psychological barriers that had protected her for 15 years. Images flashed like lightning. Joseph teaching her to weave baskets, her mother singing Cherokee lullabybus. Tommy as a young man before greed had twisted him into something unrecognizable. You son of a Joseph, breath rage filling him with strength he'd forgotten he possessed. Your own sister, your own blood. Don't talk to me about blood, old man. Tommy's composure cracked, revealing the desperate, frightened boy underneath the bitter exterior. You chose tradition over your own son. You chose dead ancestors over living family. Well, now you get to choose. Again, sign those papers and give me the sacred grove, or watch both your grandchildren die. And that whole thunder's barks echoed across the hollow like gunshots, sharp and commanding. The dog was trying to tell them something, his intelligent eyes darting between the armed men and the cellar entrance. Joseph followed Thunder's gaze and felt his blood-freeze. Smoke was beginning to seep from the root cellar's entrance, thin wisps that spoke of fire somewhere in the underground tunnels. 16 hours was generous, P, Tommy said, checking his watch with theatrical precision, but Jacob's been talking too much, asking too many questions about family business. Seems he figured out that his beloved uncle, Tommy, isn't quite the reformed man everyone thought. So we're accelerating the timeline. Tommy, please. Joseph's voice broke. I'll sign whatever you want, just let them out. Too late for that now. P, way too late. In the distance, barely audible over Thunder's frantic barking, came another sound that made Joseph's soul curl with terror, the rumble of heavy machinery moving through the forest toward the sacred grove. The bulldozers had arrived early. The world shattered like glass around Mary Clearwater as memories flooded back with the force of a dam bursting. She wasn't Mary Clearwater. She was Mary Whitehorse, daughter of Joseph Whitehorse, sister to Tommy Blackwood, and 15 years ago she'd discovered something that had nearly cost her life. Thunder pressed against her legs as she staggered, his warm bulk the only solid thing in a universe that had suddenly turned liquid. Images cascaded through her mind like a slideshow from hell. Tommy meeting with men in expensive suits behind the old grain elevator, briefcases full of cash, changing hands. Her own voice raised in righteous anger as she confronted her brother about selling Cherokee burial grounds to casino developers. You remember now, don't you, sis? Tommy's voice carried a mocking tenderness that made her stomach churn. Remember what you found in my truck that night, the contracts, the bribes, the promises to deliver Sacred Grove to Stonecrow Development. Piece by piece, Mary, she was Mary Whitehorse, she remembered now, touched the scar on her temple that she'd always been told came from the accident. But it wasn't an accident, was it? It was the result of Tommy's fist connecting with her skull when she'd threatened to expose his deals to the tribal council. I was going to tell P, she whispered, the memory crystallizing with terrible clarity. I found your paperwork, Tommy, found the money. You weren't just selling the grove, you were selling burial sites. Ceremonial grounds, places our great-grandmother considered sacred. Joseph's face had gone gray as winter sky, his weathered hands trembling as he looked between his 2 children, one a stranger wearing his daughter's face, the other a son who'd become a monster he no longer recognized. Thunder wed low in his throat, sensing the emotional devastation radiating from his adopted pack leader. You staged the car crash, Joseph said, his voice hollow as a tomb. You made me bury an empty casket. You made me grieve my daughter for 15 years. While she was alive and suffering, Tommy's face twisted with something that might have been shame. If it weren't so thoroughly mixed with defiance, I never meant for her to get hurt that bad. I just needed her to. Forget to stop asking questions. The brain trauma was supposed to be temporary, but you left me to die. Mary finished, her voice gaining strength as anger burned through the shock. You dumped me at that hospital with no ID, no memory, no way to find my way home, and then you let P think I was dead. The smoke from the root cellar was getting thicker now, and Jacob's voice came from below ground, weaker than before. Grandpa, the fire's getting closer. I can't. His word dissolved into coughing. That made Joseph's heart clench like a fist. Thunder suddenly bolted away from Mary, racing toward the tree-line with purpose that made everyone freeze. The German shepherd stopped beside a massive oak and began digging furiously, his powerful claws sending dirt flying in all directions. Within moments he'd unearthed something that made Tommy's face go pale, a metal ammunition box, military surplus, the kind used to store important documents in waterproof conditions. What the hell? One of Tommy's hired guns started toward Thunder, but the dog's snarl stopped him dead. Thunder had gone full police dog, his training overriding everything else as he protected what he'd found. Joseph recognized that look, had seen it in Thunder's eyes when he was still partnered with Officer Sarah Rainwater. This wasn't random behavior. Thunder had been trained to find evidence, and something about this location had triggered those deeply buried instincts. Mary stumbled toward the box, her returning memories providing context that made her blood run cold. Sarah, she whispered. Officer Sarah Rainwater. She was investigating casino corruption before she died, before she was murdered. Sarah wasn't murdered, Tommy said quickly, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man trying to convince himself. That was an accident, a random violence during a traffic stop. Thunder had the box open now, his nose working overtime as he pawed through waterproof bags containing documents, photographs, and what looked like audio recording equipment. Mary reached the cache and began pulling out evidence that made her hands shake with rage and recognition. She knew, didn't she? Mary said, holding up photographs of Tommy meeting with Stonecrow development executives. Sarah knew about the corruption, about the bribes, about the plan to systematically strip Cherokee lands for casino development. She was building a case. Joseph watched his daughter, his alive, breathing, remembering daughter, pieced together a conspiracy that reached back years. The old Cherokee elder felt something shifting in his chest, a transformation from grief to fury that burned with the heat of 7 generations of ancestors who died protecting this land. Thunder was Sarah's partner, Joseph said, suddenly understanding flooding through him like revelation. He saw what happened to her. He's been carrying this knowledge for 18 months, waiting for someone who could put the pieces together. Thunder barked once, sharp and decisive, then padded back to Mary with something in his mouth. A small digital recorder wrapped in multiple layers of plastic. Mary's fingers fumbled with the device as more memories crystallized in her mind. Sarah Rainwater hadn't just been investigating corruption, she'd been Mary's friend, the one person Mary had trusted with her suspicions about Tommy's activities. Play it, Joseph said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd spent too many years running from truth. Mary pressed the play button, and Sarah Rainwater's voice filled the hollow, clear and strong, despite being 18 months dead. This is Officer Sarah Rainwater, badge number 2847. Recording a statement for the FBI task force investigating corruption in tribal land development. I have evidence that Tommy Blackwood, son of Cherokee elder Joseph Whitehorse, has been accepting bribes from Stonecrow development to facilitate illegal acquisition of sacred Cherokee burial grounds. Tommy's face had gone white as bone, but his voice remained steady. That proves nothing. Sarah's dead, and even if she wasn't, tribal law supersedes federal jurisdiction. There's more. Sarah's recorded voice continued. I also have testimony from Mary Whitehorse, Tommy's sister, who witnessed financial transactions and has provided documentation of the systematic exploitation of Cherokee cultural sites. Mary has agreed to testify before the federal grand jury in exchange for protection from retaliation. The recording clicked off, leaving silence that felt heavy as storm clouds. Mary stared at the device in her hands, remembering now the fear that had consumed her 15 years ago, the terrible knowledge that her own brother was selling their heritage. Piece by piece I was going to testify, she whispered. That's why you had to make me disappear, not just to protect your deals, but to protect yourself from federal prosecution. Joseph looked at Tommy with eyes that held more sorrow than anger. Son, what have you become? But Tommy was no longer listening. His attention was fixed on the increasing smoke pouring from the root cellar and the distant sound of bulldozers. That was growing louder with each passing minute. Whatever timeline he'd been working on had just accelerated dramatically. Doesn't matter now, Tommy said, his voice carrying the hollow desperation of a man who'd lost everything and was determined to take everyone else down with him. Jacob knows too much. Sarah's evidence is 15 years old, and in about 10 minutes the sacred grove is going to be a parking lot whether you sign those papers or not. Thunder's howl cut through the air like a knife, primal and heartbreaking. The dog was staring toward the sacred grove, where the sound of falling trees had joined the rumble of heavy machinery. Joseph felt something die inside his chest as he realized what was happening. They were cutting down the grove right now while he stood here, arguing with his children. Strangers with chainsaws were destroying everything his ancestors had died to protect. You son of a bitch, Joseph breathed. You never intended to honor any deal, did you? You're going to take the grove whether I sign or not. Tommy's smile was bitter as poison. Welcome to the real world, but sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. The sound of chainsaws cutting through sacred oak trees felt like blades slicing through Joseph. White horse's soul, each falling giant sent vibrations through the earth that Thunder could feel in his bones, and the German shepherd's whines grew more desperate as ancient spirits cried out in the distance. 14 hours had collapsed into minutes, and the carefully laid plans of desperate men were unraveling like rope in a fire. Joseph closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him, not the bitter recollections of family betrayal, but the sweet ones that had sustained him through 8 decades of loss and struggle. He was 7 years old again, holding his grandfather's weathered hand as they walked among the massive oaks that had stood sentinel over Cherokee graves for 2 centuries. Listen, little one, his grandfather had whispered in the Cherokee tongue that was already fading from the world. Do you hear them singing, the old ones, the warriors who fought and died to keep this place safe? They're still here watching over us, waiting for us to join them when our time comes. Young Joseph had pressed his ear to the bark of the great mother oak, the massive tree that stood at the heart of the grove, and he'd heard something, maybe wind through leaves, maybe something more. The sound had filled him with peace that lasted 78 years, until this moment when chainsaws were silencing those ancient voices forever. But now, standing in this hollow with smoke rising from his grandson's prison and his daughter's memories returning like birds to roost, Joseph felt those old voices calling to him with different words. Fight, grandson, fight like your ancestors fought. Die on your feet rather than live on your knees. Thunder suddenly bolted from Mary's side, racing up the slope toward the sound of destruction with purpose that made Joseph's heart leap. The dog had made his choice: mission over safety, duty over survival. He was going to try to stop the bulldozers, alone if necessary. Thunder, no, Mary called, but the German shepherd was already cresting the ridge, his powerful legs carrying him toward a confrontation that could only end one way. Joseph turned to face Tommy, and his son took an involuntary step backward at what he saw in the old man's eyes. This wasn't the defeated elder who'd spent 20 years mourning a dead daughter and a lost son. This was Joseph White as he'd been in Vietnam when Cherokee warriors carried M16s instead of war clubs, but fought with the same fierce determination to protect what they loved. You want the grove, son? Joseph's voice carried the quiet menace of a man who'd made peace with violence. You're going to have to kill me to get it. Pete, don't make this harder than it has to be, Tommy said, but his voice lacked conviction. The hired guns behind him shifted nervously, sensing a change in the dynamic that made their simple extraction job suddenly complicated. Jacob, Joseph called down to the root cellar, his voice carrying clearly despite the smoke. Boy, can you hear me? Grandpa. Jacob's voice was weaker now, strained by smoke inhalation and whatever injuries he'd sustained during his captivity. The fire's getting close, I don't think. Can you listen to me, grandson? Joseph cut him off. Your great-great-grandmother used to tell stories about Cherokee warriors who found strength when they thought they had none left. She said, the spirits of our ancestors live in our blood, waiting for the moment when we need the most. Mary was pulling documents from Sarah's evidence cache, her restored memories providing context that made each piece of paper a weapon. Photographs of cash transactions, recorded conversations, detailed maps showing which tribal council members had been bought and which had remained clean. Sarah Rainwater had been building an ironclad case before her murder, and now that case was rising from the grave like an avenging ghost. Tommy, Mary said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Sarah didn't just investigate you, she investigated everyone. Sheriff Stonecrow, Judge Martinez, half the county commissioners. This whole region has been carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey, and you were just one of the carvers. Shut up, Tommy snapped. But sweat was beading on his forehead, despite the cool autumn air that evidences 15 years. Old statute of limitations doesn't apply to murder. Mary finished, and Sarah wasn't killed in a random traffic stop, was she? She was executed because she got too close to something that scared the wrong people. Bats in the distance. Thunder's barking had reached a fevered pitch, and the sound of chainsaws faltered. Joseph could picture the scene. One German shepherd facing down a crew of men with heavy equipment, using nothing but courage and training to try to protect something he couldn't possibly understand, but knew was important to his pack. Joseph's radio crackled to life. Tommy's people were checking in, their voices tight with confusion. Boss, we got a problem up here. This dog came out of nowhere, and he's not backing down. Crew spook says the animal's acting possessed or something. It's not possession, Joseph said quietly. It's purpose. Thunder knows what that grove means, even if he doesn't understand why dogs don't need theology to recognize sacred ground. Mary had found something else in Sarah's cache, a small notebook with handwritten entries that made her face go pale. Tommy, Sarah knew about me. She knew you'd staged my accident, knew I was alive somewhere with amnesia. She was looking for me when she died. Impossible, Tommy said, but his voice cracked on the word. Listen to this. Mary read from the notebook. Tommy Blackwood's sister Mary witnessed financial transactions involving Stonecrow Development. After threatening to testify, Mary disappeared following suspicious car accident. Hospital records showed Jane Doe matching Mary's description. Admitted same night with severe head trauma and memory loss. Current whereabouts unknown, presumed dead by family. Joseph felt rage building in his chest like steam in a pressure cooker. Sarah Rainwater had died trying to reunite his family, trying to bring Mary home to the people who loved her. She'd been murdered for pursuing justice and mercy in equal measure. You killed her for trying to bring my daughter home, Joseph said, his voice barely above a whisper. You killed a good woman for doing what I should have been doing all along, refusing to give up on family. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was panicked. Boss, the dogs got back up. Armed federal agents moving through the trees, at least 6 vehicles. This whole place is about to be swarming with FBI. Tommy's face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, fear, rage, and finally a terrible kind of relief. They were already coming. He said wonderingly, Jacob wasn't just investigating corruption. He was working with the feds, helping them build a case. This whole thing, the kidnapping, the ransom demand, I've been dancing to their tune from the beginning. Mary looked up from the evidence cache with dawning understanding. Jacob knew about Sarah's evidence. He's been working with the FBI to reopen her murder case. You didn't kidnap an innocent cop, Tommy. You kidnapped a federal agent. The sound of helicopters began to filter through the forest canopy, and Joseph felt something shift in the cosmic balance of the day. Thunder's desperate gambit had worked. Somehow, the broken police dog had led federal agents to exactly where they needed to be. We're burning daylight here, folks, Joseph said, borrowing one of his favorite expressions as he started toward the root cellar. And that boy's running out of air. Tommy's hired guns were already melting back into the forest, smart enough to recognize a losing proposition when they saw one only. Tommy remained standing alone in the hollow with his father and sister while his carefully constructed world collapsed around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. Tommy said, his voice small and lost. I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted. I know what you wanted, son, Joseph replied, pulling equipment from Mary's veterinary bag to help extract Jacob from the burning cellar. You wanted to matter, you wanted to provide, but you chose the wrong way to do both. Thunder's triumphant howl echoed across the hills as the chainsaws fell silent and federal agents moved to secure the sacred grove. The old German shepherd had done something remarkable. He'd saved not just Jacob's life, but the soul of the Cherokee land that had sheltered Joseph's family for 7 generations. Sometimes Joseph murmured as Mary began coordinating Jacob's rescue. The spirits don't send us what we expect, they send us exactly what we need to heal what we didn't know was broken. The root cellar had become a furnace, and Jacob Whitehorse was running out of time to make peace with his choices. Smoke filled his lungs with each labored breath as flames crept closer through the underground tunnels fed by decades of accumulated debris and the accelerants Tommy's men had used to ensure no evidence survived. But even as death pressed closer with fingers of fire and smoke, Jacob's mind remained sharp enough to recognize the bitter irony of his situation. He had spent 6 months building a case that would expose the systematic corruption destroying Cherokee lands across 3 states. 6 months of careful investigation, federal cooperation, and delicate maneuvering to protect his family while gathering evidence against the very people who shared his bloodline. Now he was going to die in a hole in the ground, another casualty of the same greed that had already claimed Officer Sarah Rainwater and countless acres of sacred Cherokee territory. 8 hours, that's how long he'd been chained in this concrete tomb, listening to Tommy's increasingly desperate phone calls as the carefully orchestrated plan began. Unraveling. Jacob had pretended to be unconscious during most of those conversations, absorbing intelligence that confirmed what the FBI had suspected. Tommy wasn't the mastermind behind the land grab conspiracy. He was a mid-level player, desperate and expendable, being manipulated by forces with reach far beyond Tennessee's borders. The real power lay with Sheriff Robert Stonecrow. Jacob's blood went cold as he remembered Tommy's panicked call from 3 hours ago. Sheriff, the federal task force is moving faster than we planned. They've got Sarah Rainwater's evidence cache, and somehow that damn dog led them right to it. We need to accelerate the timeline. Stonecrow's response had been calm, clinical, terrifying in its casual dismissal of human life. Burn it all. Tommy, the cellar, the evidence, the boy, make it look like Jacob died trying to rescue someone else. Hero, cop, tragic ending. Case closed now as smoke burned Jacob's throat and flames licked at the edges of his vision. He understood the full scope of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about Cherokee land or casino corruption. This was about a systematic dismantling of tribal sovereignty orchestrated by people who viewed indigenous communities as obstacles to be removed rather than cultures to be preserved. Grandpa, Jacob called out, his voice raw from smoke and desperation. If you can hear me, you need to know it's not just Tommy, Sheriff. Stonecrow is the one pulling the strings. He's been planning this for years above ground. The sounds of chaos were growing. Louder helicopters, shouting voices, the rapid-fire communication of federal agents, coordinating a complex operation. But underneath it all, Jacob could hear something that made his heart surge with desperate hope. Thunder's distinctive bark, the sound that had once signaled successful evidence discovery during their training exercises. Sarah's dog had found them. Sarah's partner was still fighting. 18 months after her murder to complete the mission that had cost her life, Jacob closed his eyes and let himself remember Sarah Rainwater. As she'd been fierce, dedicated, unwilling to compromise when justice was at stake. She'd been the one to first suspect corruption in the sheriff's department, the one to begin building the case that Jacob had inherited after her death. In her final recorded statement, Sarah had expressed concern about Sheriff Stonecrow's unusually detailed knowledge of FBI operations, his ability to stay one step ahead of federal investigations. He's got someone feeding him information, Sarah had told Jacob during their last conversation, someone high enough in the food chain to know which cases are being pursued and which investigators are getting close. Watch your back, rookie. This goes deeper than either of us realized. Now trapped in a burning cellar while Tommy's world collapsed around him, Jacob understood exactly how deep the corruption ran. Sheriff Stonecrow hadn't just been protecting Tommy's land deals. He'd been using Tommy as a front for a much larger operation involving federal contracts, tribal gaming revenues, and the systematic theft of indigenous resources. Across multiple states, the flames were getting closer, now licking at the wooden support beams that kept the cellar from collapsing entirely. Jacob tested his bonds for the 100th time, feeling the rope burn his wrists raw as he struggled against knots that had been tied by professionals. His throat felt like sandpaper, and each breath brought more smoke into lungs that were already struggling to process the toxic air, but even as his body began shutting down, Jacob's mind remained focused on the mission that had brought him here. In his jacket pocket, sealed in a waterproof evidence bag, was a micro SD card containing 18 months of federal surveillance data, phone conversations, financial records, surveillance footage, everything the FBI needed to dismantle Sheriff Stonecrow's operation and bring justice for Sarah Rainwaters' murder. That evidence had to survive. Even if Jacob didn't above ground, he could hear his grandfather's voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of a man who'd spent 8 decades learning how to command respect in crisis situations. Joseph Whitehorse was coordinating the rescue effort with federal agents, his knowledge of the cellar's construction providing crucial intelligence about safe entry points and structural weaknesses. The main tunnel connects to a drainage system from the old mining operation. Joseph was explaining, if you can get through from the north side, you'll have access to the chamber where they're holding Jacob, but be careful, my grandfather built that place to survive cave-ins and flooding. If it collapses, you won't be digging anyone out. Jacob heard the sound of power tools cutting through metal, felt vibrations through the concrete walls as rescuers worked to reach him, but he also felt the increasing heat from the approaching fire, saw smoke growing thicker despite the ventilation. Shaft that connected his chamber to the surface. Time was running out, and Jacob had to make a choice that went against every survival instinct he possessed. Using his feet to kick debris into position, Jacob managed to create a small barrier between himself and the evidence bag, then used his body weight to wedge the waterproof container into a crack in the concrete wall if the fire reached this chamber before rescuers did. The evidence might survive even if he didn't. Thunder, Jacob called out, hoping the German Shepherd could hear him through the chaos above. Thunder, find the evidence, find Sarah's case. He didn't know if Thunder would understand, didn't know if the psychological trauma of losing Sarah had damaged the dog's ability to follow complex commands, but Jacob had seen enough of Thunder's work to believe that some bonds transcended death, that love and loyalty could bridge the gap between species and even between the living and the dead. The sound of cutting tools grew louder, and Jacob realized his rescuers were getting close, but the fire was closer, flames beginning to curl around the edges of the chamber as accelerants turned what should have been a slow burn into an inferno designed to erase evidence and eliminate witnesses. Jacob thought about his grandfather, 85 years old and still fighting to protect Cherokee land from people who viewed indigenous culture as an obstacle to profit. He thought about Mary, his sister, who'd lost 15 years of her life because she tried to stand up to corruption. He thought about Sarah Rainwater, who died because she refused to look the other way when powerful people committed crimes against the powerless. And he thought about Thunder, a broken police dog who'd spent 18 months grieving his murdered partner while carrying the knowledge that could bring her killers to justice. I'm sorry, Sarah, Jacob whispered as flames began licking at his boots. I'm sorry. I couldn't finish what you started. But even as he spoke the words, Jacob heard something that made his heart leap with impossible hope. The sound of metal giving way, of heavy machinery, moving debris, of voices calling his name through smoke and fire. Jacob, Jacob, can you hear us? The voice belonged to FBI agent Sarah Chain, the task force leader who'd been coordinating the investigation into Cherokee land corruption behind her. Jacob could hear his grandfather's growly voice providing direction. Mary's medical training being put to use as she prepared to treat smoke inhalation and burns, and cutting through it all, Thunder's triumphant bark as the German Shepherd located the evidence bag Jacob had hidden in the wall. Found something. Agent Chen called out, the dog's indicating evidence in the wall cavity. Get that fire suppression unit in here now. Jacob closed his eyes and let himself believe for the first time in hours that he might actually survive to see justice done. Thunder had done it again. Sarah Rainwaters' partner had found the evidence that would finish what she'd started 18 months after her murder. The cavalry had arrived, and they had 4 legs and a badge that glinted in the firelight. The truth hit Joseph White like a sledgehammer to the chest as he watched FBI agents help his smoke-blackened grandson from the burning cellar. Jacob wasn't just a detective who'd stumbled onto corruption. He was an undercover federal agent who'd spent 6 months systematically documenting the destruction of Cherokee sovereignty. Every family dinner, every casual conversation about tribal politics, every moment when Joseph had wondered why his grandson seemed so interested in land development issues it had all been part of an elaborate investigation that reached far beyond. Tommy's small-time graft grandpa Jacob wheezed, his voice barely audible through the oxygen-masked paramedics had strapped to his face. "I'm sorry, I wanted to tell you, but the operation required." "Hush now," Joseph said, gripping his grandson's soot-stained hand with fingers that trembled like autumn. Save your strength, boy. We'll sort out the explanations later." But even as he spoke the comforting words, Joseph's mind was reeling, with implications that made his 85-year-old heart race with something between pride and terror. If Jacob was federal law enforcement, if he'd been building a case against Cherokee land corruption for 6 months, then everything that had happened today, the kidnapping, the ransom, demand, the destruction of the sacred grove, it was all connected to something far more dangerous than family betrayal. Thunder pressed against Joseph's legs, the German shepherd's amber eyes bright with the satisfaction of a mission completed. In his mouth, Thunder carried the waterproof evidence bag that Jacob had hidden in the cellar wall, and Agent Sarah Chun was already photographing its contents with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient scrolls. "My God," Agent Chun breathed, scrolling through files on Jacob's micro SD card. "This is everything: phone records, financial transactions, surveillance footage going back 2 years, Sheriff Stonecrow, Judge Martinez, 3 county commissioners, and at least a dozen tribal council members. They've been systematically looting Cherokee resources and selling them to casino developers." Mary knelt beside the evidence cache she'd pulled from Thunder's original discovery site, her restored memories providing context that made each document a piece of a massive puzzle. "Sarah suspected Sheriff Stone Crow was the mastermind," she said, holding up a photograph that showed the sheriff shaking hands with executives from 5 different casino development companies, but she never realized how big the operation was. Joseph studied the photograph with eyes that had seen too much betrayal for one lifetime. Sheriff Robert Stonecrow had been a fixture in Cherokee County for 30 years, elected and re-elected on promises to protect tribal sovereignty and traditional values. He'd spoken at powwows, participated in naming ceremonies, presented himself as a guardian of Cherokee culture while secretly orchestrating its systematic destruction. "How long?" Joseph asked Agent Chun. "How long has Stonecrow been selling us out?" "Based on what we're seeing here, at least 15 years, Agent," Chun replied, her voice tight with professional anger. "But the really sophisticated operation, the one involving multiple states and federal contracts, that started about 3 years ago, right around the time Jacob graduated from the police academy and began working his way into positions where he could gather intelligence." The pieces clicked together in Joseph's mind with sickening clarity. Jacob hadn't just happened to investigate Cherokee land corruption. He'd been recruited specifically because of his family connections, his insider knowledge of tribal politics, his ability to move through Cherokee communities without arousing suspicion. The FBI had used his own grandson as an unwitting weapon against his own people. "You turned my boy into a spy," Joseph said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man who'd learned to kill silently in Vietnamese jungles. "You sent him undercover against his own family." "With respect, Mr. Whitehorse," Agent Chun said carefully, "Jacob volunteered for this assignment. He came to us after Officer Rainwater's murder, convinced that her death was connected to the corruption she'd been investigating. He wanted justice for Sarah, and he wanted to protect Cherokee communities from the systematic theft of their cultural heritage." Thunder suddenly stiffened, his hackles rising as he stared toward the tree-line beyond the sacred grove. The German shepherd's growl was low and dangerous, the sound of a police dog alerting to immediate threat. Joseph followed Thunder's gaze and felt his blood turn to ice water. Sheriff Robert Stonecrow emerged from the forest with 4 heavily armed deputies, their tactical gear and assault weapons suggesting this wasn't a routine law enforcement response. Stonecrow himself looked like a man who'd run out of options and decided to bet everything on one final hand. His normally neat uniform was disheveled, his silver hair wild, and his eyes held the flat desperation of a cornered animal. Well. Stonecrow called out, his voice carrying across the hollow with false cheerfulness. "Looks like we've got ourselves a regular family reunion, Tommy. "You disappoint me, son. I told you to handle this quietly," Tommy, who'd been standing in sullen silence. While federal agents photographed evidence that would put him in prison for the rest of his life, looked up with something approaching relief. "Sheriff, thank God these federal agents are overstepping their jurisdiction. This is tribal land, Cherokee. Sovereignty applies." "Shut up, Tommy," Stonecrow said pleasantly. "You've outlived your usefulness." The gunshot echoed across the hollow like thunder, and Tommy Blackwood crumpled to the ground with a look of surprise frozen on his face. Blood spread across his chest in a pattern that reminded Joseph sickeningly of the poppies that grew wild in Cherokee graveyards. Mary screamed a sound that came from somewhere deeper than grief and threw herself toward her fallen brother, but Thunder was faster, positioning himself between Mary and the armed deputies with protective instincts that overrode everything else. "Now then," Stonecrow continued, his voice maintaining that same pleasant tone despite having just committed murder in front of a dozen federal agents, "I believe we need to discuss the terms of my retirement. I've got 30 years of secrets buried in Cherokee County, and some of those secrets involve federal judges, senators, and at least one member of the current presidential administration agent." Chin had her weapon drawn, but Stonecrow's deputies had them outnumbered and outgunned. The standoff stretched across the hollow like a wire about to snap, with Jacob, barely conscious from smoke inhalation, Mary, cradling her dying brother, and Joseph, standing at the center of it all like an ancient oak tree that refused to bend. "You killed Sarah." Thunder's behavior made it clear the dog recognized Stonecrow's voice, his snarls growing more vicious with each passing second. "You killed her because she found out about your operation, Sarah." Rainwater was a romantic, Stonecrow replied, his eyes never leaving Agent Chin's weapon. "She believed in justice and truth, and all those other fairy tale concepts they teach in law enforcement. She couldn't understand that sometimes progress requires compromise, that preserving Cherokee culture might mean sacrificing Cherokee land." Joseph felt something ancient and terrible stirring in his chest, the rage of 7 generations of ancestors who'd watched their people betrayed by those they'd trusted to protect them. Sheriff, Stonecrow hadn't just stolen Cherokee land and murdered Cherokee officers. He'd perverted Cherokee sovereignty itself, using tribal law as a shield for crimes that would have destroyed any other community. "You want to know what real Cherokee justice looks like?" Joseph asked, his voice carrying the weight of 85 years and all the wisdom they'd brought. "It doesn't come from courtrooms or federal agents or men with badges who think they're above the law." Thunder's howl cut through the air like a blade, primal and heartbreaking, and filled with 18 months of grief that had finally found its target. The German Shepherd had recognized his partner's killer, and every instinct bred into his powerful frame was screaming for vengeance. In the distance, more helicopters were approaching, their rotors beating against the sky like mechanical thunderbirds, but Joseph knew that, by the time reinforcements arrived, this confrontation would be over one way or another. The spirits of the sacred grove were calling for justice, and sometimes justice came with 4 legs and teeth sharp enough to balance the scales. 6 months later, Joseph White Horse sat on his cabin porch with Thunder curled at his feet, watching the sunset paint the sacred grove in shades of gold and crimson. The ancient oaks stood untouched, their massive trunks bearing witness to another chapter in the long story of Cherokee survival. Federal protection had arrived just in time to save the grove from Stonecrow's bulldozers, and the land that had sheltered 7 generations of White Horse ancestors would shelter 7 more. Thunder wore a new collar, now hand-told Cherokee leather, with both his police badge and traditional Cherokee symbols worked into the design. The German Shepherd had officially retired from law enforcement, but his new job as guardian of the sacred grove seemed to suit him perfectly. Joseph often found him patrolling the treine at dawn and dusk, as if checking on spirits only he could see. "You know what I learned in my 85 years? Thunder," Joseph said, scratching behind the dog's scarred ears. "Sometimes the spirits don't send us what we expect, they send us exactly what we need to heal." What we didn't know was broken. Thunder's tail thumped once against the porch boards, not quite a wag, but close enough to hope the broken police dog had found his peace in protecting the living rather than hunting the dead. And Joseph had found his family restored in ways he'd never dared imagine. Mary, his daughter who'd come back from the dead with 15 years of wisdom and veterinary Skills had moved into the old cabin down the hill. Her memories had returned slowly but completely, like spring water filling a long dry well. She'd started the Second Chance Animal Rescue, specializing in police dogs and military working dogs who needed new purpose after trauma. Thunder was her first success story, but not her last. Jacob recovered from his smoke inhalation and returned to work, though his role had shifted from undercover agent to tribal liaison for the federal task force investigating corruption on indigenous lands. The evidence Thunder had helped uncover led to 63 indictments across 4 states, dismantling a network that had stolen millions of dollars from tribal communities over 2 decades. Sheriff Robert Stone Crow would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His deputies had surrendered when reinforcements arrived, choosing cooperation over a gunfight they couldn't win. The man who'd spent 30 years betraying Cherokee trust while hiding behind Cherokee law now faced justice in a federal courthouse where tribal sovereignty couldn't protect him. Tommy's funeral had been small, attended only by family and a few old friends who remembered the boy he'd been before greed twisted him into something unrecognizable. Joseph had spoken at the service, his words carrying the weight of forgiveness that comes hard but heals deep. My son made terrible choices, Joseph had said, standing beside Tommy's grave in the Cherokee cemetery overlooking the sacred grove. But he was still Cherokee, still my blood, still worthy of the prayers that carry our people home to the ancestors. I forgive him his trespasses, and I ask the spirits to guide him to the peace that escaped him in life. Mary had wept at those words, grief and relief tangled together. Like morning glory vines, she'd forgiven Tommy too, understanding that his betrayal came from desperation rather than malice, from a young man's terror of watching his culture disappear, one compromise at a time. The evening light was fading now, purple shadows creeping across the valley as nightbirds began their ancient songs. Joseph heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up to see Jacob approaching his grandson's stride, strong and confident despite the ordeal he'd survived. Evening, Grandpa, Jacob said, settling into the rocking chair beside Joseph's. Thunder keeping you company other way around? I think, Joseph replied with a smile that creased his weathered face into familiar lines. That dogs got more sense than a tree full of owls. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. 3 generations of protection. The elder who'd guarded Cherokee traditions, the agent who'd fought Cherokee corruption, and the dog who bridged both worlds with loyalty that transcended species. Thunder dozed between them, one amber eye occasionally opening to scan the treeine before closing again in contentment. Mary's got news, Jacob said, eventually good news for once. Joseph raised an eyebrow. Oh, the federal government's returning the mineral rights to the sacred grove, all of them. Oil, gas, coal, everything Stone Crow sold off over the years. The tribe will have complete sovereignty over the land for the first time since the 1950s. Joseph felt tears threaten the corners of his eyes. And the casino developers, prosecuted for conspiracy and fraud, their contracts are void, their investments forfeit. The sacred grove will stay exactly as it is sacred. Thunder lifted his head at the word sacred as if he understood its significance. The German shepherd had spent enough time in the grove to recognize its importance, had seen how the Cherokee community gathered there for ceremonies and prayers. He'd appointed himself unofficial guardian of those gatherings, sitting quietly at the edge of the circle while Joseph and other elders shared stories in the Cherokee tongue. You did good, boy, Joseph told Thunder, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah would be proud. Thunder's tail wagged properly now, a full sweep that spoke of contentment and purpose. Found he'd never forgotten his murdered partner, would always carry her memory in his powerful heart. But he'd learned that honoring the dead sometimes meant protecting the living. As full darkness settled over the valley, Joseph heard something that made his soul sing, the sound of young voices speaking Cherokee, Jacob's children learning the old stories from their great-grandfather, the ancient language flowing like water over stones worn smooth by time. Sometimes Joseph murmured Thunder's warm weight against his legs, anchoring him to a moment that felt perfect in its simple peace. The spirits work in mysterious ways. They send us exactly what we need when we need it most. Thunder's answering rumble might have been agreement or contentment or simply the sound of a dog who'd found his pack and intended to guard it with everything he had. In the sacred grove nightbirds sang Cherokee lullabibus to the sleeping spirits, and all was right with the world. Some say old dogs can't learn new tricks, but sometimes it's the old dogs who teach us the most important lesson of all, that love ain't about being perfect. It's about never giving up on the ones who matter, and Thunder had never given up, not once, not ever. Friends, if you've lived long enough to see your hair turn silver and your children grow gray, you know that life has a way of breaking your heart and mending it in the same breath. Thunder's story isn't just about a dog who saved a cop, it's about the fierce loyalty that binds families together even when we've lost our way. How many of us have watched our children make choices that broke our hearts? How many have wondered if we failed them somehow, if love wasn't enough to keep them safe from a world that values profit over people? Joseph White spent 20 years believing his son was lost to greed and 15 years mourning a daughter who wasn't dead. But sometimes when we think all hope is gone, grace walks into our lives on four legs and refuses to give up on us. Thunder knew something we forget too often, that family isn't perfect people doing perfect things. It's broken souls choosing to love each other anyway, choosing to fight for each other when the world says it's not worth the trouble. That's the kind of loyalty that lasts beyond death, beyond disappointment, beyond all the ways we let each other down. That's the kind of love worth fighting.